pamodušies un, jā, lai lūgtu tie, kas ir pievienojušies šobrīd. Tātad pie mums ir Katrina no Igaunijas. Jā, labāks un tātad viņa mums šodien stāstīs par savām divām lietām. Tātad pirmā lekcija būs par vispār viduslaiku un renesanses tērpu spēti. Un otrā būs konkrēti par liecībām par tērpiem viduslaiku un renesanses Tallinā. Tā ka tas varētu būt arī dot mums priekšstatu par to, ko mēs sastopam šeit. Okay, Katrin, the floor is yours.
Okay. I don't know where to stand or how to be. Anyway.
You can have somebody sitting there and pushing the buttons if you want to.
Okay. I'll come a bit aside. My goal today is to talk about on two subjects. First of all, what's the first part is on researching medieval clothing. What are the main sources and what are the main kind of keywords when researching that? I did my master's thesis this year in the Institute of History in Tallinn, and my main goal was to first of all, go through the archaeological evidence, what we have about, from the excavations in Tallinn, and then also looking at the artwork we have, mainly focusing on the early 16th century and mainly on one particular piece of art, which is the Pavasara cenotaph on the side of St. Nicholas Church in Tallinn old town. About myself, I've been researching and making and teaching clothing history, mainly medieval clothing, for, 14 years now. I have done my bachelor's degree in Era University as a fashion designer, and for my bachelor's degree thesis or bachelor's degree work, I tried to make a reconstruction of an Italian woman's everyday clothing, which consisted of a kind of written thing, this side, and also a full set of clothing from head to toe, which meant there's footwear, there's stockings, two dresses, shirt, pins, laces, belt, and also woven headcloth. One of them is with the frilled edges, which is quite typical to the 14th and 15th century. So it was, for me, it was quite logical to move on to on the same theme, but also I wanted to take more on the scientific side, and that's why I entered the Tallinn University's Institute of History. When we talk about the custom history and researching custom history, it's actually quite a recent field of study, and there aren't very many researchers in Europe or in Scandinavia, or, well, not talking about Estonia. And when I try to see or research on what's done before, it's quite interesting that most of the work started in the early or late 19th century with the descriptive custom history books, which most of you have looked at, laughed at, and which are really descriptive, very illustrative, great drawn pictures, but from the researcher's side, they are mostly quite useless because of a lot of false images forced into people's minds. And nowadays, most researchers take them as children's books and just, something to look and laugh at. In the 20th century, the custom history can be divided in three categories. One's researching for theater, then there's archaeology, and there's custom history, from the art point of view. And quite a lot of books have been written on that, and some of them are really good. The amount of books, as you probably know, is quite wide, But as for the earlier ones, a lot of them have to be read with care. And it's always good and useful to keep in mind the goal of why the book was written. Because when it's archaeology, then it talks mostly about the finds. When it's costume history from the art point of view, it talks only about the paintings. And what concerns the theatre is that for them, it's very important only the visual side. What you see on the stage, that it looks, if you look at it, you will recognize, yes, it's medieval, yes, it's 19th century, and that's about it. They never concern themselves with proper underdresses, proper patterns, proper materials. What they want is only, you know, the visual. From iconographic view, it's quite understandable and quite well, but it's not very suitable for researchers, reenactors, and people like that. Fortunately, in the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, there are quite a, well, I can't say quite a lot, but there are researchers who have started to take or to look at the costume history interdisciplinary, meaning that they will include both the archaeology and also the artwork and also the written sources. And from my point of view, this is the only way to really get into the depths of that theme. In Estonia, so far we haven't had a single costume historian. All the works written are by the people from other fields. They are either archaeologists who look only at the finds and try to find the context and the meaning of the finds. There are also art historians who look at the art and try to find also some connection somewhere else. And there are historians. And basically the list you see is the upper part is all we have on costume history, which is very scarce. I only looked at those who are talking about medieval clothing, because the pre-medieval, the Viking era, all that, is totally different, and there's a bit more, just a little bit more written on that. Although we still don't, in Estonia, we still don't have a single official reconstruction of the Viking age clothing. We're still guessing, and we're still a bit behind of you and the films. When we talk about the scientific work, there's also quite a few things or works written on that. Some of them are bachelor's theses and some are master's theses. Pretty good, but unfortunately for you and quite many others, most of that stuff is in Estonian. Although I think there are a couple of things, a couple of short articles which I can suggest and which are also in English. And as I also already said, there is no one ideal source of information, and none of the sources by itself is perfect or enough. Yeah. When we talk about the pictorial evidence, the late medieval art, as you know, is quite detailed and gives us a lot of information, which gives to those who know what they are looking at and what they are looking for, gives them a good possibility to guess what we see about the pattern, about the materials, about the accessories. But one really important thing to keep in mind is the medieval iconography, which follows certain rules and which definitely needs to be taken into account. Because when we look at the religious pictures, statues, altars and so on, all the saints and of course Christ is mostly, not always, but mostly depicted in a very stylized way. They're wearing something remotely ancient, which can be almost anything. What concerns about the saints is that they can be also stylized, They can be really fashionable, but there's, in most cases, there's quite a lot of fantasy. So all those characters, which are not real, have to be studied very carefully. There's quite a lot of instances where most of the clothing is quite correct, and then there are some fantasy details, which, if you don't know, will take, well, most of it is correct, so that means everything has to be correct. But unfortunately, it's not so. About the plus size, the medieval art is usually quite accurate, and in quite many cases, when you look at the portraits, you can see the seams. You can get, sometimes you can see the stitches, sometimes you can understand between different ways of decoration and all the accessories. Sometimes about the cuts and also about comfort and how the clothing sits on a person. And also there are quite many cases where you can see the people from different social classes, ethnic groups, countries, religions, and also different situations. Working, being at home, being in bed, well, whatever. But there are also quite many minuses. And in Tallinn's case, we have very few examples that depict townspeople clothing. And that's one of our kind of sad parts. And most of the medieval art in Tallinn is either produced elsewhere or by imported masters. That may reflect local clothing or way of clothing, but sometimes it also may not, and may give you only impression of what the master either thought or what he knew from his previous life or experience. And not all depicted characters are dressed like townspeople. And that refers back to the iconography, and the religious and mundane characters usually dress in certain ways, but there are also very many exceptions, and that's what makes understanding art so difficult. In my case, when I looked at the Pavasara, one of the biggest discoveries I made is that it is unusually real. The only character who is always stylized, in stylized clothing, is the Christ. But Pavasara is a rare example of how all the apostles are not wearing the typical, robes like the Christ, which are, loose and almost without any proper cut. But they have a lot of modern details. They have buttons, they have colors, they have turned cuffs, they have, in some cases, I will show you the pictures later, they also have some modern cut details, like on the back there is a bunch of folds and things like that, or footwear. And also depending on the materials used, and also on the artist, the depicted clothing is not always very detailed. It may be, but it may be not. It all depends on so many different variables. But then again, when we talk about archaeological finds, it's the only straight way of getting to know the things or the objects as they were. How they were produced, what they look like, what are their measurements, and it also can give you information about their popularity, ownership, usage, and so on. And for my thesis, I went through the funds of Institute of History and Tallinn City Museum. Those are two main funds or collections that we have, and going through all that material, I have to admit that I didn't get exactly what I was hoping for, and it gave a bit different view of what we actually have. So far, nobody had gone through those collections looking for things connected to clothing. As I said, the plus sides are, we can get best information about the object itself, and also how and does not present textile, which means that everything we have is in really tiny pieces. That actually applies to most of Estonia. We're not really unfortunate in that way. Compared to you, we have almost no textile at all, except for, really small ones. And also, as during the Christian Middle Ages, the dead were buried without proper clothing, or fancy clothing and grey boots. Most of what we have comes from cesspits or are accidental finds. And that gives a very one-sided view of the archaeological and material culture. Also, depending on the existence or non-existence of context and interpretability, it's really difficult sometimes to date them. The timeline is usually quite wide, and as the archaeologists are not always, well, they tend to give quite wide time periods if it's not datable. That means that some things can go from, let's say, 13th till 17th century if it's a mixed material, so you have to know the thing itself to be, at least a little bit sure. And also a problem that we have had, and which I believe is quite common also in other countries, is that sometimes the archaeologists don't have a very kind of big interest in clothing details. And sometimes it means that they don't write them down, draw them on the maps as they were found. And that is actually even worse in the case of the pre-medieval things. Because we have had loads of earlier excavations where, for example, the bronze spirals were just, picked up. So you have a box of bronze spirals and you have no idea how they exactly were. Were there any pattern? Was there something else? Of course, sometimes the soil has rotted away all the organic material, and all you have is a box of spirals. But it's also known that when they were digging in the southern Estonia in Siksala, very close to Latvian border, it is said, I'm not sure, I hope it's not true, it is said that the archaeologists only picked up pieces big enough to fit in the box. And if the piece was too big, this is one of the things I don't want to hear about, and I do hope it's not true, but I have heard it from older archaeologists, and it seems to be a very sad truth. So there are quite a lot of problems with the archaeological finds, but then again, it's the only real source that we have. The third source is written evidence. All kinds of wills, city government's papers, and all the kind of inheritance lists and all like that is a very good material when it comes to telling the amount, describing the material, also describing the price, and what else? It also gives clues about the usage and types of clothing among different social classes. Because quite often it's said that the city government bought that much of brown woolen and that much of green for the town guard, for example, or something like that. And also the sumptuary laws which try to limit the usage of certain materials or accessories gives us information about the actual situation. If there is a need to limit, that means that there's excessive amount of that thing happening. This sumptuary laws is a bit different theme. There's a pretty good diploma thesis written on that in Estonia. There are two sumptuary laws of from late medieval Tallinn, and they differ a bit from the ones in the rest of Europe. Because it seems that here, although they try to limit some things, they are not going into very deep depths of the thing. And also, as they same regulations try to tend to repeat from one law to another. It says that the reality did not accord to that. People were still using those materials and those accessories. The written material about the clothing is actually quite limited. And usually, in quite many cases, it's just one line or two comments. The earliest dressing law we have is from the late 15th century, and the second one is from 1524, which is very little. And also what they have is, you know, about that much information, and mostly concerning the German type of clothing. They try to say that the pearl, whatever it is, stitching with pearls and some materials are prohibited for some social task. Which brings us to one of the biggest problems when it comes to the written material is that a lot of those terms have changed in time. We don't exactly know anymore what some of the words mean. Although we can understand, yeah, it's shirt sometime of some sort. But what's the cut, how it was made, how big it was, and so on and so forth, we don't know. And also the translations depend very much on the translator. And with the sanctuary laws, the Estonian ones, we have had that problem that the translators translated, you know, in the way of early 20th century. And when I read it, I can read something totally different. Because the earlier translation about this pearl klappen was that it's pearl buttons. But it probably means more stitching with pearls, which is more into the theme. And also the problem in Finland is that the locals have used quite a lot of terms which are very local, meaning that they are either originating from Estonian or one of your languages, and which you can't, you know, compare to the rest of German-speaking areas. So, with all those sources, each one of them gives a bit of information, but without looking at all of them, you can't get an overall picture. And even if you're looking at all of them, the picture has still huge holes in them. And depending on the time period which you're looking about, it may be that you don't have much of material at all. One of the reasons I focused on the late 15th century, early 16th century is especially that. We have more written evidence, we have more pictorial evidence, and we have more archaeological finds. Because the earlier Middle Ages, we have, well, very, very, very little. Another problem with the sources is the reliability and interpretation. I will now talk about the biggest legend, biggest misinterpreted thing we have in Tallinn. And that gives a pretty good kind of view of what you see, what you understand. If you know, and if you don't know what you're looking at, that may give you very interesting results. The picture on the right is Kuningas Ottoman's tombstone, which is now situated in Katrin Passage in Tallinn's old town. Anyone can go and look at it. From the late 19th century, this lady has been, well, in written sources, different books and a couple of articles. It is said that there you can see a lady in a trim jacket wearing a hooded cape. For those who know a bit more about that clothing, you can see that the only correct thing in that description is that it's a lady. because you see what you understand. The original pictures, which you see on the left, and the extant garments, which you can see on the right, it's actually a sideless circle, or a sideless dress, and which is often lined and trimmed with fur. That means that you have the white trim. But somewhere in the 19th century, when they started to write those very descriptive history books, what wasn't there, the sleeves, turned into something that's there, a jacket. So the trims are all on the same spots, but actually, you know, it's a totally different thing. And this type of legends, well, all the custom researchers fight them every day. You know, like the one where Hennin, the 15th century fancy headdress, when it's described, it said that it's 1 meter long and it has a veil hanging from the top of it. And it's on that angle. Now, if any engineer would explain me how you put it on and how, first of all, it doesn't tilt and it doesn't draw your head back, and how do you put it on? With a nail? I don't think it will hold that well. Nail is probably a bit better. The interpretation of all those evidence is a very tricky thing, and it takes quite a lot of work. What more? I'll show you the Green on the Shotomus tombstone also in the other presentation, but because the actual drawing of this one is also, it has mistakes in it. I'll talk about it later. Another problem that we encounter, which you encounter, which we encounter, is the local social and ethnic situation. Because in most of Europe, the country people dress as townspeople. Although, well, the basic cut is the same. The fabrics differ, the color differs. They don't have that fancy overdresses and jewelry and so on. But the basic cut, the basic idea is the same. But around here, it's totally different. Up to 20th century, our townspeople and country people dressed totally different. They had some things that were either the same or had the same, similar cut. But the basic idea, where it comes from, is totally different. And well, most of you know it quite well. But when I talk to some European researchers, they're like, really? You sure about that? Maybe you're mistaken. Maybe there's, you know, something else in there. Okay, that's about it. So basically what I wanted to tell about is that during that process of 3-4 years when I was writing my master's thesis and going through all those sources, I discovered that the more I research, the more I research, the more questions I have. So I must say that although I know a lot more, I also know a lot less. More questions than ever before. But on that subject, oh, that was fast. That was really fast. Maybe I can show you even more big pictures later on. Ask me questions. You probably know most of the stuff I told you, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Good. But sometimes it's really good to keep in mind all those little details and all those local differences. And yeah, for me, going through the archaeological material was really eye-opening, because what we have is really scarce. We have some hooks and eyes and some belt parts. We have little pieces of textile, but there's not really much to hang on to. It's only a helping material, which is actually really sad. And there's also, as the archaeologists tend to base their datings on some interesting ideas, I ended up correcting a find, which was actually dated back to the 16th century. I was so excited. You know, there's a part of sleeve, or what does it say to this sleeve? A part of sleeve, well preserved, from the attic of the Tallinn city hall. And wow, it's great. It's 16th century. It's right into my, you know, theme, and it has buttonholes. And it's well preserved. In the end, it turned out to be. I don't remember how it, what was the first description, but it turned out to be part of a sleeve from the 18th century. So that was pretty interesting. And the Tallinn City Museum was also a bit surprised, but nevertheless quite happy that, oh, at least now we know what it is.
But they accepted your feedback. Actually, I would like to hear more about that science lady.
Some more pictures?
Yeah.
Because this is the only silent circle picture or that we have in Tallinn. And actually the material we have on art is not that much. Anything else you want to ask, or shall I just carry on with the fast tempo and put on the next one?
Well, I believe you can carry on. You can also slow down a little bit and go in more detail.
Okay, because
you really have enough time.
Yeah, well, I didn't know how much. Well, I haven't tried to talk about or make a presentation on that thing before, so I'm kind of scared that I'm always running out of time. Because mostly, one of those, the most popular things I've talked about is the evolvement of the fashion from the 13th to 16th century. I took it with me just in case, which has 114 slides, or something like that. And with that, it's always the problem of fitting into the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. If it works. Now comes the more interesting part. There are some pictures.
Tad, kad līdz jums atnāk šitā grāmata, tas ir vismaz es tā kā tur ir vairāk bildīšu.
Logiski.
Actually, it should be pictorial element. I tried to make a timeline from 13th till 16th century. The material we have is not very wide, and most of it has some kind of problems. The only things we have from the 13th century are from the Rotaļa XO, the Queen and King of Denmark. I would say it's a pretty good impression from the 13th century, and unfortunately it's all bad, and it's not even about our local ones. The next one we have is the Kuningul tombstone. As I told you, it has been the most misinterpreted thing we have, and also the dating. Well, we know when she died, but the descriptions have always been very vague, and mostly consisting of the same lines as I said, the hooded head. Although when you look at the original one on the right, and try to compare it to the one on the left, you will immediately see the mistakes, like the neckline. Because when you look at the original, you will see that the cape actually goes behind the neck. When you look at the drawing, there's a totally different line. Also, the same applies to the sleeves. which on the drawing are not bending, although you can see the length of the sleeve on the original. And the biggest thing that gives away that it's not actually a jacket, the trimmed one, is when the original is not so in detail on the picture, but actually you can see the belt on the underdress and under the side of the shirt. I have been given a permission from the Cultural Inheritance Board of Tallinn to go and make a new drawing of that thing, but so far it's been hectic times and too little time. But there will be a newer and better drawing. What else can I say? It's the best we have from the 14th century. Except for the Burgermeister's bench in the Tallinn City Hall. It has, the bench ends have two scenes. It's Katrin and his older and Simpson with the lyre, which is interesting in many ways. First of all, it's very accurate in details, although some of the details have been worn away in the time. A bit interesting info about that is that when you look at the right end of that bench, there's a man with a lyre, and then there's a figure sitting under that tree in the cape with a hood. I have better pictures of that. In none of the materials written so far, nobody has mentioned that figure. It's always omitted. Nobody says who it is, why is it there, why is it dressed like that. But when we look at the details, this is really good kind of depiction of the late 14th century. I think, did we have the year right? Yeah, 1374. As you can see, the man's wearing the short jacket with the small sleeves, with the buttons on front and with the high collar. You can also quite well see the shoes and the belt with the metal fitting. The woman is even more interesting because actually you can see the lacing on the side, which is really well depicted. You can see the lacing on the side, and you can also see that there are buttons, the square ones, going, well, the sleeves are long, and you can see the buttons going from the very end of the sleeve up to almost to the elbow. Not all the buttons are intact. Actually, on the left one, when you look at the original, you can see where they have been, but they're just most of them have been, you know, falling away. There are some damage to the bench ends, but quite a lot is still intact. I really like that. Now, when it comes to the small figure, you can clearly see the cape with the small holes up here, which is interesting, and you can see that the cape is open in the front, so it's not nothing else. But more interesting is the hood she, yeah, is wearing, I think it's a she. Let's show them. The hood is round in the front, but, no, down there. But it has the point in the back. The cut of that might be like the one in Koncerts, which has the squares in the front and the back, and thus giving the point. But this one omits that, and that's interesting in a couple of ways. First of all, this type of hood is also depicted in one of the churches in Estonia, which I don't know by heart at the moment. I can find it out. I have the picture somewhere, where a man is wearing that type of thing, and also the Cistercian monks are sometimes, and sometimes also I think Benedictines have been depicted with that type of hood, round in front and with a point in the back. In Tallinn City Hall, we also have the newer Burgermeister's bench. Which doesn't have a proper date. It has been debated for a couple of decades on where exactly does it lie. Is it the end of 14th? Is it the beginning of 15th? And nobody wants to say for sure. But then again, looking at the details, it's also quite detailed. You can see the man's belt and the slit in the front on the tunic, and you can see the woman's where the dress is tightened, where it widens, and all those big sleeves, and of course the headdress and the braids. And then we have on the lower part of that bench end, we have really nice. And why I like it so much is that it's the only picture in Tallinn where you can see the man's underwear. You can also see the hose, the stockings, and you can see the boots, which have lacing on the inner side. There. You also get to, of course, see the hat and so on. But it's a great find. It's been standing there for centuries, and nobody's really, gone and looked at it. The other end of that bench is also, pictures don't show that well here, sorry. It's also really interesting and also very debatable. And those historians who in Estonia deal mostly with armor and stuff like that also have mixed opinions, saying that not all the details are from the same period and it's debatable, and basically the time difference between their statements is over 50 years. So, yeah. But the details we have are actually quite interesting. You can see the iron glove. You can see also the knee protectors and the leg armor. And you can also see the really fancy belt, mostly associated with the late 14th century, which usually seems to, being held up by very good will or something. Although it doesn't seem very logical. I won't go into any more details or suggestions. The small guy, the small guy is a bit more modest, that one. And there are lesser details on David and Goliath is the thing you have said so far. The rest, basically what we have is altars. And as I said before, it's always about the medieval iconography, which has to be taken into account, but there are there are several good examples of both the fantasy part and also the realistic part, because this is the main altar in Holy Ghost Church in Tallinn by Plkst and his team, late 14th century, and all those characters depicted here have quite a lot of the fantasy element. Mostly what to look at the pictures are all the little figures, extra figures, like the beggars and crippled ones up there, which usually, or the two little boys on the bottom right, who usually are depicted in a realistic way. They are dressed in a way as people were dressed. The soldiers, mostly, usually, are depicted in the newest, highest fashion, but quite often in an exaggerated way. There are added fantasy elements to make them look even fancier, more colorful, more, extravagant. Because by the Christian standards, fashion, or being fashionable, is, well, I can't say it's a sin, but it's not a very approved way of doing things. And those depicted most modernly are usually on those altarpieces are the soldiers. And also sometimes kings and people like that. More of the interesting things we have on this altar, except for the beggars and those, are the materials. It's really, really colorful. Plus the bed and the interior details. The more important, or more interesting for me is the high altar from the St. Nicholas Church, which is also late 15th century, and it has a bit better view of different clothing details. And for example, if you look at St. Nicholas, you can see the cape with a huge collar put on his shoulders. And when you look at the man with his three daughters for whom he doesn't have enough money to get them married, the man with the long tunic and the proper food and the belt pouch. And when you look at the girl's dress, there are the huge arm size, and there's one of the type of the dresses where it's so wide and that almost has the folds in front. And also the bedsheet material or the pattern of that. Or when you look at the soldiers and marchers on the lower left corner, you can also see the actual cut of the clothing. Although this altar too has quite a lot of fantasy elements, you can omit them, and you can look at the patterns and see the examples of what we already know from the European fashion in our own backyard, basically. Well, not backyard. For me, it's close. Bit more pictures. Also, what I really like is the long red tunic and the belt pouch. But an interesting piece are those mantles, things with the fur color. And when you look at the very, very, very modern soldier there, you can see the cut of the jackets and with all the full folds. Unfortunately, you can really, really, really rarely, when you go to the church, you can go and see up close that far. And I'm really, really grateful to the museum for giving me the pictures. I can't publish them, I can't, share them, but I can study them, and I'm really grateful for that. Also on the same altar, the altar wings and the saints. As usual, the saints are a bit tricky. They can have the actual garment, but they can quite often also have a little bit or a lot of fantasy. But I would say that for a woman's dress cut, it's a quite good example. More of 15th century is the St. Mary altar of blackheads. In the same church, there are altogether I'm not mistaken. But there are 3 that are most interesting ones. Really nice about this one. Well, excluding the floor tiles and the back paneling and stuff like that, are the donators, who are believed to be the blackheads. Their clothing is also quite accurate, quite well depicted, and there are different examples in them of the different types. I really like the fabrics in this. The most well-known artwork is Bertnotke's Das Macabre, which is also situated in St. Peter's Church. Unfortunately for a researcher, there is not that much material left as there might be in the beginning, as it used to be a 30-meter long story. But from that, this is all we have. And we're really fortunate to have him on this. There are a couple of pretty good things you can look at, but there's also quite a lot of fantasy, obviously. On the background, somewhere there, I don't think I brought it with me, there's also 2 mundane figures, everyday men walking on the hillside somewhere there, but they're about that big in the actual size, so not very much you can say about them. And the one more interesting altar comes from the early 16th century, is the altar of Christ's Passion. Really good view on the donators and their clothing, and also some other details like the man helping to carry the cross. When we, as we moved into the 16th century, we come to the theme which is has been most important to me during the past couple of years, is the plkst on the side of St. Mary's Chapel in St. Olaf's Church in Tallinn. It's on the outer side of the church, so anybody walking past it can just go and look at it. Quite rarely people do that. Quite often even the people who have lived in Tallinn for most of their life and have been walking past the church, often don't even know it's there. Nevertheless, talking about going and looking at the details. When I held there was a course in the university about late medieval, early modern art, and I made the course paper on that theme, and we went there, and then I talked to the teachers or lecturers and the co-students that what I see there, and they were like, oh really? Never noticed that. And when a lecturer says to you the same words, who know that that piece of artwork for quite a while, then yeah, it's interesting. Anyway, the Koncerts was made from 1513 till 1516. It was supposed to be memorial kind of biblical scenes. There's actually the center niche is now empty, but they suppose there was a Christ and cross in the center. And in the lower part, which is actually depicted differently, lies a skeleton with the frog and the snake. And there's also the writing on the back wall. I focused mostly on the biblical scenes, there are 8 of them, and they're actually quite accurately based on Ulrich Pinder's book from 1507, which had religious texts and also about 70 pictures. And the plkst follows the main theme or main kind of composition of those pictures. I have them as a illustrated ones on the right. But the interesting part is that compared to the example from Ulrich Winter's book, the Pavasara is more realistic, more historically accurately depicted when looking at clothing. It's also more static. It omits a lot of extra characters who are not needed, and sometimes it also differs in the or where the characters are or what they are doing. When we look at the actual scenes, I didn't go by the well, I started basically from the top left and then carried on. There's actually been at least 2 masters doing that work. All the pictures are done in different times and by at least 2, if not 3 masters. You can see the difference in details and also the complexity. Huh? Yeah, complexity. Because some of them are really, in detail. They have a lot of everything, but some of them are really plain and just, silhouettes. It is guessed that it was originally painted, but now there is absolutely nothing of the paint left. They're so good for, looking at the details, looking at the clothing, and even now when they're worn out and a lot of the detailing might have been gone, there's still quite a lot left. The first one I started with is Christ in front of Caiaphas. As it was said. Actually, it follows the picture where the Christ is in front of Hannah. What I want to kind of put your eyes on. First of all, the soldier on the left with a really fancy shirt, jacket, straight trousers, and very typical to that period shoes. And really nice mustache and beard. Yeah, the proper landsman. As I said, the soldiers are usually in modern clothing, and this is a very good, the cenotaph is a very good example of that. What else? Christ in all the scenes is in a very simple tunic. In a couple of scenes, he also has writing on the neckline. But more important are the 2 Slavic figures on the background. None of them existing in the originals, and they seem to be of a local add-on to that. Because in the scene, most of the characters are actually, the elderly ones who make the law and follow, see that it comes true. The Slavic ones have there are 2 scenes where you can see them. They have the typical hat. They have a typical kaftan with the front fastening. And also inside the church, there's also a figure, a statue actually, of the same Slavic type. Also the older town's, important guy in the center with the mantle with the lapels, who actually is wearing a hat, which I suspect is a beret with where the edge actually is in 2 parts. One of them is turned up and the back one is turned down. Exactly the same type of berets the extant ones are found in the British National Museum. Is it correct name? Well, I've seen the extant ones who look exactly like that, so it was a pretty good find. And berets like that are in quite many scenes. The second scene is the crowning of Christ with the stolen crown. You can see that the master is, it's much less detailed than the previous one, but the difference still is not that huge. You can still see soldier on the left with the shoe line, typically early 16th century, and the narrow trousers. All of the soldiers on that canton have the narrow trousers with the, well, moderately big codpiece. And the soldier is bald, a very typical way of showing that the person is bad. The medieval iconography very much accentuates or stresses on the fact that you can tell the difference whether the character is good or bad, whether he's high-ranked or low-ranked. And it's all through clothing, mimic, whether if the mouth is open, if the face is ugly, that must be a bad person. And also the same applies to the baldness or the hair. And that's one of the reasons why the guy is really bald. The guy on the right, actually, who should be the soldier by the main idea, is actually dressed like a townsman. He has the long robe with the lapels, and he also has the beret with the earpieces. The one in the center is a bit more difficult to define, but he also looks something in between. Pilot washing his hands from all of this. Pilot is one of those few characters in that kenota who has something that's not so easily relatable to the actual garments, the huge hat. And the something on the sleeves. Because all the other characters can be referred as more realistic. The guy pouring the water, you can't really much see, but he seems to have one of those long tunics which you will see like the soldier has a short jacket type of thing and a helmet. The clothing, when it's loose, if it's not properly fastened or it's hanging somewhere, is also a very typical sign of showing that that can't be a proper or good person. Christ bearing the cross. The soldier on the right, who has the proper look, and the guy whose name I can't say, who's helping to carry the cross, are an interesting combination. This whole scene is also one of those who are really playing, really without the actual or detailing. There are quite a few. But the guy on the left, as you can see, is wearing the simple type of outfit, which is so typical from the 13th century up to basically 20th. I don't know about you, but we still have amongst our folk costumes, we have the medieval cut tunic, exactly as it was, and even the hood. Although the ones we have, well, they still look basically the same, and it hasn't changed. But only if you look at the footwear, you can see that yes, it's an early 16th century. In the scene, Johannes and St. Mary. Mary is the only woman on that canopy, and even that, and even then she's hidden, behind everything else. Other than that, all the scenes are only about the males. Arriving in Jerusalem. Although the picture is really bad, and the actual scene is also, you have to, go there and look at the details to see them. This is one of the most elaborate ones. Because when you look at the soldier on the right, with a puffy sleeve up to here, and narrow trousers again, and the shoes, the hairnet he's wearing is actually really, detailed. You can see it's a net, and it has the front gathering up here, and the detailing. The guy next to him actually has a ruffled neckline or ruffled shirt under his longer tunic and a soft beret. And on this picture, the Christ has a neckline which has writing on it. The apostles also have more modern garments. The guy on the left has the mantle with the big collar and fastened under the chin. On the back there, you can see one of the guys, he's clearly Slavic due to his beard, the mustache and the hat. And the bishop next to him has been debated for quite a while who he is. Is he the bishop of Tallinn, or, but so far nobody knows and nobody has said for sure. The Last Supper. This is one of those pictures where you can really, go through all those characters and see very, very interesting details. As I said, most of the apostles at all have something modern. This guy actually has a collar and a button. This guy is the most interesting one, because when you look at it in detail, he has a belt on, and up under the belt you can see the folds. The bunch of folds that then widen to the kind of downwards. Typically early 16th century, but really rarely seen on men than on females. And I haven't gotten a good kind of comparison among apostles for that type of clothing. Christ on the Mount Olive. Also a good example of how the apostles can be wearing modern outfits. The buttons, and how the fabric is stretched between the buttons. The distance between the buttons is actually quite big, and you can see the fabric being pulled apart. The sleeping Johannes has the turned down sleeves, sleeve cuffs, and also you can see the neckline with a small tiny collar. There haven't been people looking at the actual weaponry, but that I don't know much about. The last scene, which is also one of the most interesting ones, also like the drive into the Jerusalem, a very detailed one, where you can see things from two types of helmet, quite typical one, up to a type which is, well, as a helmet it's not so much used, but it reminds a lot of the Phrygian hat, which is typical, also very typically used on bad characters. The third helmet on the back has the pointy edge or top. The guy here, with great mustache. What he's wearing is actually on top of the, I think it might be a shirt. He wears a breastplate, which has stripes on it, and you can also see the belt, and the cutlass, and the trousers, and the shoes. That guy actually, he has a very elaborate hairnet with all the things you see that yes, it's a hairnet, and also a tunic which is buttoned up front, up to basically the waist, and seems to be widened downwards. The guy here has the same simple clothing like on the previous one where the guy was helping to carry the cross. The downwards widening tunic and a hood. Although on top of the hood he wears the helmet and a 16th century breastplate. which also is interesting in that canata is that when we are in modern times, we are so used to the thing that women and men button their things on different sides. But during the Middle Ages, it was really irrelevant. And up to 19th century, it didn't matter. There was no difference between men and women, and you could do it either side. And also this canata, the apostles are wearing their button differently. On some it's the button to the left, on some it's button to the right. The monk who's sitting down is a good example of a bad character. He's bald. He's sitting with his back to the viewer. He is not properly dressed. He doesn't have shoes on. And thanks to that, you can actually see that his trousers or stockings or whatever they are don't have the foot piece. You can see the bare heel and the bare part up to here. He also seems to have the tunic, which is simpler. That was in brief. I tried to be short. So basically, up to the second quarter, well, basically middle of 16th century, this is what we have. We have very few other examples, but they mostly consist of either, a small section or, a small detail somewhere. But this is about it. Questions?
Es varu palīdzēt ar tulkojumu, kā tu grūti noformulēt jautājumu.
Mums jāizdomā. Tā vienmēr ir visgrūtākā daļa.
Jā.
It seems that, well, I don't know exactly about the textiles because there hasn't been a proper division. Nobody has gone through them and saying, yeah, this is definitely imported, this is local. But it seems that most of the fabrics that I've seen are probably imported. About the jewelry parts and the belt parts, it seems that what I found was a surprisingly big amount of locally made jewelry, which is more typical to the Estonians or the country people, so to say, of the local origin. And but there are so few evidence that it's really hard to say how much is what. We do believe that yes, some things were imported and a lot of them probably were in real life, but the evidence doesn't give a very good, overview of that. There's so few.
I understand that from the archaeological finds, quite a lot of those finds are probably of the local origin and of the concept. So you could say that Tallinn wasn't a place of only foreigners living separately from the local people, but it was part.
Really interesting theme to me is the actual social and ethnical consistency of the city, because we don't actually know how many were of local origin and how many were the foreign traders. There have been talks here and there, and we also don't know how the locals dressed in that period and how much the locals living in town, how much they took in the foreign fashion. Nobody has researched it so far. But among the archaeological finds, there was quite a lot of the local material. about where the myth was found, because there's at least one region in Tallinn Old Town, where we know that mostly locals lived, and there are also a lot of local fights. But as most of the material comes from Sestdien and even more comes from the mass grave, late medieval, early modern, there you really can't say much anymore, because it's the worst thing the lecturer can say. I don't know, but it's you know, it would demand further investigation or research. But then again, the material is so scarce that it's very hard to, you know, to say something on that thing. And that's also one of the reasons why the archaeological part is only a small piece of my thesis, because there was a lot less of it than I hoped for. There's only, you know, one piece of purse and some hooks and some belt parts and some buttons, and well, that's about it. Yeah, we have boots, but boots are a bit different theme, and I didn't include them in my work because there's in Tallinn there's Krista Sarv, who's an archaeologist and who has spent the last 15 years or something, no more, almost 20 years on researching leather goods and boots. And there are some pretty good articles about that, so I decided that I'll stick to more to the clothing part.
Are those articles also available?
There should be at least 2. I'll try to track them down and let you know. Or questions? Silence.
Kas ir par vācu ordeni? Vispār ir kāda bildes? Man liekas, es dzirdēju kaut kas ir Tallinnā par vācu ordeni apģērbu. Vai kaut kas tāds, viena bilde, ko it kā esot Igaunijā.
The question is about any depiction of the German order brothers, their dress. He says he has heard that there is some depiction of it in Tallinn. Do you know?
Not from Middle Ages. It all goes past that time.
One picture is in Johann Christoph Brod's. It's German order from the brochure. You know?
No, I don't think I know. That's interesting. We need to talk about that more.
Okay.
Because in all the information I haven't gotten my hands onto, I'm always, you know, open to all the comments, all the critics, and all the new information, obviously. And
I know this picture. I have.
Then you can send it to me.
Vēl kāds jautājums?
You can also ask about the things I haven't told today. So if I'm already here, if I can be of any help, just use the opportunity. I had with me my 14th century dress, which I didn't know whether it was needed.